Which Scrambler is fun off-road, comfortable for touring, makes a great daily rider, and yet offers the best value for your money? Here in Florida, I rode and compared 4 Scramblers that make similar power, but you could easily get the wrong bike if you don't compare them the way I did researching for my next bike. The Bear 650's 270-degree parallel twin engine is the most characterful of them all. The cable-actuated throttle, crisp fueling, and butter-smooth gear shifts have become a signature of that Royal Enfield platform. It comfortably lugs along in low revs, loves it in mid-range, and stays surprisingly smooth. I found it the most enjoyable at 65 to 75 miles an hour, but you could push it over 90 if you're running late for your Fast and Furious audition. The Triumph Speed 400X is its closest rival, but a single-cylinder engine cannot be expected to be as smooth as a twin. However, it does not feel as vanilla as some Japanese singles. It's noticeably tractable in low revs, loves cruising at 5000 RPMs, and I gave it some rough love to test the stalling issues mentioned in the online forums. But even starting off in 3rd gear and taking it all the way to 80, I couldn't manage to stall it. It does get buzzy after 6000 RPMs, but for short runs, I found that quite exciting. Being significantly lighter than the Bear, it feels a bit quicker, but the power to weight ratio is the same. The clutch pull is certainly lighter, but the clutch engagement felt a little off for my liking. The transmission is significantly better quality than smaller Bajaj bikes I rode decades ago. The upshifts are much nicer than downshifts, which were occasionally a bit clunky. In hindsight though, it may be because of the rough love it got from others before it was my turn. The Svartpilen 401 has the most potent small capacity engine that feels like a tiny hyperactive kid just drank a can of Red Bull. I rode my buddy Sebastian's bike, which had the previous generation 373cc engine, but the 2025 Svartpilen 401's bored out 399cc engine makes similar power and has the same revvy, rowdy character as per ownership reviews. It wants to stay in higher revs, and riding over 7000 RPMs is exhilarating. 75 to 80 miles an hour is easy, but typical single-cylinder vibrations are undeniable. It feels a bit high-strung for highway cruising, but back in the city, it does not like being close to the lower revs either. Under 3000 RPMs, the throttle isn't smooth and it doesn't like downshifting anymore. In contrast, the Honda is much happier in low and mid-range, but runs out of breath at the top end. It's called SCL500 in the UK and Australia, and SCL500 in US and Canada. Not sold in India, but the NX500 has the same engine and therefore character. Some might disagree, but running without a fuss across the rev range is also a character. Fueling is on point, stalling issues are unheard of, but you may find vibrations at the top end if you really start looking for them. 75 to 80 miles an hour is not difficult, but a zen state of existence is found at 65. Running highway speeds feels like you're having more fun than you should, but the bike continues to behave itself. Hands down, it is the best slip assist clutch with the lightest clutch poles and the smoothest transmission in the segment. And even though all 4 bikes are capable of American interstate speeds, overtaking on Florida highways does take monk-like patience and well-timed downshifts. If you're watching my video for the first time, my name is Faraz and I love to make thoroughly researched, honest comparison videos to help the riding community. But this time it's also for me. Before I started riding a ZX6R on American road racing tracks, I used to be a touring enthusiast. As much as I still love the racetrack, exploring the beautiful beach towns of Florida on my XSR 900 has made me miss my touring days, but long-distance comfort was not exactly a priority for Yamaha designers. So I'm testing, comparing, and researching bikes that are not only fun around town, but also capable for touring and some occasional off-road trails. Shout out to Rider Market Orlando and Ducati Orlando for supporting the filming of this video. You should definitely check them out if you're ever in Florida, where I hopped onto each bike and found that the SCL500 has the least aggressive bend in the knee, while the Speed 400X has the least forward lean, which deserves a thank you note on behalf of my lower back. Husky is the most aggressive, but if you grab the tank with your knees, you feel a lot more in control. Interestingly, the seat height is not exceptionally differentiated between the first three, but the Honda is actually the most short king friendly. The Bear 650's seat height felt a bit taller than it should, but I'll tell you a solution later in the video. Interestingly, rear brake levers being too close to the engine case is a silly quirk that the Honda shares with the Royal Enfield. All bikes have nice wide handlebars, but the Husky was closer to a street bike. Royal Enfield's weight in not so precious metals is felt the most when you try to roll or park it. On the go, the weight helps it feel stable, but it's not like the Speed 400 has any worse stability. Honda and Husky aren't bad either, but what really starts to bother you on all four bikes is the wind blast. I felt fine up to 70 miles an hour, but over about 75 to 80, I was a non-aerodynamic test dummy forced into a wind tunnel. On a positive note though, the seats on all four bikes felt pretty comfortable for a 60 to 90 minute ride, which I did confirm with ownership forums. The Triumph seat does slope forward. That was threatening my ability to procreate. Thankfully, being a sport bike rider, I'm used to grabbing the tank with my knees and protect my future generations. So we're good there. But constantly grabbing the tank is not sustainable for long tours or highway cruising. So I would recommend aftermarket windshields and comfort seats. But if you don't like spending money on aftermarket parts for brand new bikes, I have an interesting observation for you later in the video. But when it comes to braking, the Bear 650 does have much better brakes than the ones on the Super Meteor and the Shotgun. Just the right bite for the road, but also enough modulation for low traction conditions, which I was able to test when it started sprinkling in the middle of my test ride. In stark contrast, the 400X front brakes bite like a granny without their dentures. Triumph guys told me they're using organic brake pads for better off-road control, but I would just switch to sintered brake pads instead of having to take an anxiety pill every time I brake. For trail riding, I would just depend on rear brake modulation instead. Husky has the sportiest braking setup with 4-piston radial calipers, steel braided lines, and sintered brake pads, and of course its lower weight, better suspension, and grippier tires are also significantly helping its braking performance. The Honda brake configuration may not look exceptional on paper, but the axially mounted Nissan calipers have a decent bite. However, it's the only scrambler in the group that doesn't let you disable rear wheel ABS for off-road shenanigans. But does that mean it's not a real scrambler? Well, most modern street scramblers are actually trying to be as good as a sports touring bike on tarmac, but better than a street bike off tarmac. Hence the choice of 19-inch front wheels and 17-inch rear wheels, which are often found on touring bikes. Husky is the only one that stuck to a 17-inch front and rear combo for a more sporty handling. Bear 650 and the 400X have the same tire size, and the Honda has a slightly different profile. MRFs on the Bear 650 are not that bad, but the Metzlers we get in the US on the 400X are slightly more confidence-inspiring. Pirellis on the Svartpilen are comparable, but the smaller size, lower weight, and sportier suspension make it a lot more flickable. In India, the Svartpilen gets Apollo Trampler XR, but thankfully owner reviews are positive. The Dunlops on the Honda are also pretty decent for street riding, but the main difference is in terms of convenience. The 400X and the CL500 have cast wheels with tubeless tires, while the Bear and the Svartpilen have spoked wheels with tubed tires. Spoked wheels look really cool, but only until you have a flat tire. Good news is that Husqvarna lets you switch to cast wheels, and Royal Enfield is rumored to offer cross-spoked wheels with tubeless tires at some point in the future. All four wheel and tire combos are pretty decent on road, but for off-road, most experienced riders will tell you to stick to light off-road trails only. That's why I can see why media reviews are calling the spoked wheels a design choice. But I feel the ruckus they created about the suspension being too stiff is a bit exaggerated. On the surface of the moon we often call the streets of downtown Orlando, I deliberately went over manhole covers, potholes, and space debris to test out the suspension and handling. The wide handlebar enables throwing it into a turn surprisingly better than I expected for its size and weight. Once in a turn, it felt rock solid. I personally like stiff suspensions that give me feedback about the available grip, but if I had to do this daily and over long distances, it will get tiring. And that's why I demonstrated in my last video why the Bear suspension feels like that and what can we as riders do about that. Suspension that is forks in the front and shocks in the rear have springs in them. and those springs are rated for different ranges of rider weights. For example, this All-in shock from my ZX6R race bike build is rated for a rider that weighs between 160 and 180 pounds with full gear on. But before I bought this shock, I had to put on all of my gear, weigh myself, send the numbers to my suspension guy so he could then install the right springs for my weight. This Showa shock from my stock ZX6R also has a spring, but it's kinda hard for Kawasaki to know how much each and every rider on the planet weighs and what riding conditions are they going to ride it in. So manufacturers make estimates and assumptions. Royal Enfield claimed that they sprung the Bear for a rider plus luggage or passenger, and that's why if you're a larger, heavier rider or have a passenger or luggage on the back, you'll be fine. But a solo average sized rider will naturally find it a bit stiff. For $0, you can try and play with the preload or let the suspension break in as per the internet, but the proper sustainable solution is swapping shock springs, which by the way is no different than swapping exhaust pipes that have no impact whatsoever on riding comfort or handling, but everyone still keeps buying those. However, unlike Royal Enfield, Triumph did not assume that all of their riders would either be food delivery representatives or motorcycle taxi drivers. So the gas-charged Showa monoshock on the Speed 400X feels well sprung for an average-sized rider. It's just as stable as the Bear mid-corner, but is a little easier to tip into a turn because of the lower weight and possibly better tires. But because of a softer rear spring, it compressed when I hopped onto the Triumph, whereas the Bear rear shock springs barely moved, making it feel taller than it should. Triumph suspension is also sporty on good roads but well damped for bad roads as well. But if you weigh 200 pounds, you will bottom it out unless you get the right springs. The Svartpilen 401 on the other hand has a pretty sporty suspension, but the best part is that it's adjustable. Standard setting is fairly comfortable for everyday use, but with a couple of clicks of the adjusters, you can make it feel sportier or comfier as per your preference and the riding conditions. The handling is exceptional going into corners, staying confident mid-turn, and then exiting with the same confidence. The springs seem to be rated for average-sized riders who would be much happier than Hulk Hogan's out there. The CL500 also has Showa suspension, but the setup is the comfiest of the four. And even though it's kinda soft sprung, the combination of the suspension, frames and tires allow it to feel quite pleasant going through turns. But if you think loads of features increase the bang for your buck, I would ask you, do you like paying for things that you're not going to use? For example, the Bear and the Husqvarna have navigation as standard, but ownership forums do not have great reviews about them and most people just end up using their phones. Thankfully, Bear, Husky and Triumph have conveniently placed USB charging ports under the dash, but Honda is stuck in 2010 and still offers a cigarette lighter type 12-volt charger as an extra accessory. And as exciting as LED headlights appear on the brochures, ownership forums have mixed reviews about the brightness and utility of the stock ones. Triumph and Husky have bash plates as standard, but Royal Enfield has adjustable levers. A headlight grille and handguards are standard on the 400X, but none of the bikes get a center stand, which you're gonna miss during chain maintenance or fixing a flat tire. CL500's swing arm is a little funky, so I've linked a rear stand you can use for maintenance. What really set these bikes apart is the tech. The Bear and the Husky have the most modern, information-loaded TFT dashboards, but Triumph chose a hybrid analog/LCD layout similar to Triumph bikes from 10 years ago. SCL500 has a basic LCD dash which is hard to read, but it gets better if you turn the brightness all the way up. And here's a controversial opinion. Bikes that make under 50 horses do not need riding modes or traction control, but that did not stop Husqvarna from throwing in 2 riding modes, switchable traction control, and cornering ABS. Interestingly, they dropped the ride modes and cornering function in India, hopefully for a competitive price tag that we will compare later in the video. You still get a bi-directional quickshifter that's not standard on the other 3, but if you really want one, you can have an up-only quickshifter on the Bear and the CL500, and theoretically, a bi-directional quickshifter could work on the Triumph. But do street bikes really need one? Well, your opinion might change when you learn how they work. Bi-directional quickshifters are actually a combination of 2 different mechanisms, a quickshifter for clutchless upshifts and an auto blipper for clutchless downshifts. Both originated in racing. The quickshifter electronically closes the throttle, which unloads the transmission, which then allows you to upshift. So even if your bike doesn't have a quick shifter, all you need to do to unload the transmission, instead of pulling in the clutch lever, just close the throttle and then click the next gear up. Watch it again. Auto blippers are a little more complex because of what they're trying to mimic. When going into a corner at high speeds, racers don't have enough time to let the bike slow down gradually for a smooth downshift. We need to downshift quickly, so we do something called rev matching, which is quickly pull in the clutch, flip the throttle, which is a quick twist to increase the RPMs, catch a downshift, and let the clutch out quickly. Watch it again. An auto blipper does all of that electronically, but it only works on bikes with ride-by-wire throttles like the Speed 400X and Svartpilen 401. People gushing over quick shifters conveniently forget that this tech was developed for racing where no one ever shifts in low revs. That's why street riders trying to use bidirectional quick shifters in stop-go traffic find them frustratingly clunky. So I would humbly recommend learning manual clutchless upshifts and rev matching for downshifts. Share this video with your friend who needs to learn how to shift, or just for the sake of the exhaust notes comparison that everyone seems to like so much. I hope you were able to pick your favorite one. To me, the Bear 650 sounds the coolest, but penny pinchers might ask you about the fuel efficiency. Being a heavy air-cooled twin, the Bear is the most thirsty, but the biggest fuel tank gives it a reasonable range. The Husqvarna is actually the most fuel efficient, and the biggest tank in 2025 gives it the longest range. But you've got to remember, these numbers may vary, and I like to take conservative estimates so no one ends up pushing their bike to a gas station. But what about going to a service station? Well, Triumph has the best-in-class service intervals, but Royal Enfield mechanics would love to see you more often than your grandparents. In the US, that's an expensive date at the dealership. Royal Enfield has the longest warranty, but if you're outside the US, I would recommend checking with your local dealership because warranty terms often vary by region. Unfortunately, the longest warranty does not always correlate with reliability. The Bear is relatively new, so one could hope it's better built than previous models. I could see the regulator rectifier move to the front, which could theoretically reduce the battery and related electrical issues. Similarly, the initial batch of the Speed 400Xs had stalling issues, which were later fixed with a software update. The new Svartpilen has also had some stalling issues reported, but thankfully there aren't any oil leaks reported in the forums yet, which used to be the way for older Husqvarnas and KTMs to mark their territory. Looking for reliability issues with the Honda feels like trying to break a Nokia phone, but I will link all the ownership forums I went through for my research so you could also do your own homework. But before you do that, it might surprise you that Royal Enfield has the biggest price tag, but that's thanks to a higher capacity engine, even though all four bikes make similar power and target a similar segment. To me, the Speed 400X seems the most competitively priced, but the Svartpilen value proposition is also pretty good if you value the adjustable suspension and the electronic rider aids. So which is the best scrambler in the segment, and which one should you avoid? Well, that depends on the things that you value the most. Bear's looks are outstanding, the engine character is fantastic, and it's got some useful features, but most people may need a spring swap, and it's not an ideal bike for touring. Resale value and reliability are a bit low, especially in the US, but I'm hoping newer Royal Enfields would turn out to be a little better. That's why I'm planning to ride and compare a bunch of them very soon. please subscribe to watch those videos. But if you're picking one right away, the Speed 400X has better fit and finish and looked quite at home parked with the rest of the Triumphs. The suspension setup works for most riders, feels light and nimble and therefore quicker in short sprints. Clutch engagement wasn't my favorite and stock brake pads need to be changed, but the two rivals are equally capable for light off-roading, which is actually also true for the Husky, but its key advantage is the adjustable suspension. The engine character is a bit sporty, but it's enjoyable in mid-range. Anything lower and higher does feel a bit rough. Which, by the way, is the biggest strength of the SCL500 because of its smooth engine throughout the rev range and a happy-go-lucky character. About the looks, I was gonna say they're made for people who don't care about vanity, but custom garages have proven that Honda designers just don't get laid enough. I mean, paid enough. Honda's smoothness and reliability need no introduction, but it is still not the best bike in the world for touring. I would highly recommend watching this video where I compared 650cc purpose-built touring bikes or this one if you're considering adventure riding. Which brings me back to my dilemma. As much as I love the looks and character of the Bear 650, it's not designed for long distances, especially on American highways, so my search continues. This is for us balancing between the heart and the head, one video at a time.